In this video, I'm going to talk to you guys about my favorite functional fitness training exercise, and that is isometrics. This is something you can do every day, and I recommend that you do it every day for the maximum benefit. But the keys to this is technique and frequency, right? So you got to know what to do and how to do it, and then you got to do it a lot. So that's really the point. So we're working with neuroscience here and also physical science. So just sit back and I'm going to try to discuss it as detailed as I can, but also kind of as short as I can and save you guys some time. But anyways, there's different types of isometrics. There is one moving that's a quasi-isometric. That's not what I'm going to be covering here. I'm going to strictly talk about ones where you're not moving or you're trying not to move. So the first one is going to be yielding isometric. An example, I use this often. Take a weight out, resist the weight from moving. You try to keep this perfectly still for as long as possible. For about 30 to 45 seconds. That's a good window for daily growth, is 30 to 45 seconds. But that's mainly targeting the type 1A muscle fibers, your endurance muscle fibers, and it'll get a little bit of the type 2A, your raw power muscle fibers. Not necessarily the type 2X, which we'll get into in a little bit. But again, 30 to 45 seconds in a yielding isometric, that's a good way to look for. So also, an example of a yielding isometric is a plank, where people are planking and working on their core. That's a yielding isometric using gravity. But if you're outside of 45 seconds and you're further along, then maybe you want to put a backpack on if you want to get better at planks. But anyways, for my uses, like for a gripper, this is an isometric because I'm using an outside source of tension that is trying to move me. I am supposed to be that immovable object, and that's why it's a yielding isometric. This unstoppable force of, whatever it is, like 20 pounds of tension or whatever, eventually it's going to overcome my muscles. So I won't be an immovable object anymore. So that's a yielding isometric. So eventually I will yield to the spring or gravity or, whatever. So that's a yielding isometric. It's very good for building endurance and also building power in certain cases. But it also does have a physical benefit in that it somewhat does actually help you build a physique a little bit. So that's kind of interesting. So the next one is an overcoming isometric. This is where we have an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object. This is where you're like trying to take this wall and push it and move this wall. You make your body rigid and you're just trying to push with your arms. Or if you're in like a push-up position, say you're in a push-up position like this, you put your hands out like this and imagine you're trying to squeeze the earth like a ball of paper. And you're trying to squeeze it and smush it under your hands. That's conducting an overcoming isometric. You do these for about 5 seconds. They say you can do it from like 4 to 10 seconds. I've heard it from 4 to 10 seconds, but I think 4 seconds is a little short. You're kind of moving out of the type 2A muscle fibers, your strength, and you're moving into the type 1A when you get to around 10 seconds. So I would say just stick within 5 seconds so you can target the type 2A muscle fibers for that raw strength. And the idea on the overcoming isometrics is not so much that you're building like muscle and stuff. The idea of the overcoming isometrics is we're starting to get into the territory of neuroscience where we're actually unlocking the brain's inhibitor that prevents certain motor units from using a certain amount of muscle fibers at one time. Because we will actually do that. Our body does actually have an inhibitor. So that's just kind of how it works. This is where you're starting to use this exercise to unlock your capabilities. And this is something that's been going on for hundreds of years. So old-time strongmen, even today, they still use this to unlock strength capabilities. So that's an overcoming isometric. Now we're getting into the ballistic isometric. Basically the same as the overcoming isometric. The time is different and the purpose is different and how you do it is different. So again, trying to squish the earth in like a push-up position, well, you're trying to squish the earth right now. So maximum amount of force in the shortest amount of time. In an overcoming isometric, yeah, you're putting a maximum amount of force in, but imagine it's kind of going on a graph that's kind of like this, where you're kind of building up the strength. Well, no. With a ballistic isometric, you're doing this and holding it. You're going as much strength as possible. So strength output to time, an overcoming isometric, and a ballistic isometric. You're trying to get as much strength output as possible in the shortest amount of time. This is something that you're going to only do for like a second, maybe 2 seconds. But this is targeting your type 2X, the fastest twitch muscle fibers. This is like the muscle fibers that are, well, it's kind of self-explanatory. They're the fastest twitch muscle fibers that you have, but they are the shortest lived. So these are the things that are going to give you the ridiculous amount of power, and it's great for startup muscles. So if you're struggling to lift a heavy weight, like in a bench press, this is very common. People get it off the rack and they lower down, and then they can't push back up. This is where your type 2X muscle fibers really come into play to kind of save your life, is to get that off and deliver a lot of strength in a very short amount of time to prevent you getting crushed by that nice little bar, because you're trying to conduct a 1 rep max. It's really your 1 rep max muscle, the type 2X. So again, we're working with neuroscience here, and we're trying to unlock the capabilities. We're trying to recruit as much of the type 2X as possible, and we're also trying to shorten the amount of time that those type 2X muscles get recruited. Pretty cool. So the times, I already talked about the times of each one. A yielding isometric, stay within 30 to 45 seconds. You can go for longer, but you're mainly only working on the type 1A muscle fibers, and you're not working on as many as you could be at one time. It can be pretty slow going as far as the progress. Now the sets. If you're being honest with yourself, then you're probably going to be limited to about 4 sets. You could probably push through 6 sets, but when you're conducting like an overcoming or a ballistic isometric, it can actually be pretty tough to actually be targeting the type 2X or the type 2A muscle fibers, because they're fast oxidizing and they're kind of slow at regenerating. So that's the thing. Now, the rest part. For the yielding isometric, say you're going for 45 seconds and you hit 45 seconds at the end every time. Rest for 45 seconds. You can even rest for 50 seconds, that's fine, but don't be resting for much longer than that. You're working on the type 1A muscle fibers, they'll regenerate pretty fast, and you'll still probably have a lot that need to get worked anyway. So don't worry about resting too long with the type 1A or the yielding isometrics. So the overcoming isometrics, this is where you're probably going to want to rest for 20 to 30 seconds, maybe 40 seconds, depending on where you're at in your sets and how burnt out you are. Because if you're being honest with yourself, just because you're struggling along doesn't mean you're working type 2A muscle fibers. If you're not actually giving it enough rest to kind of somewhat recuperate and be continually worked in that specific area of the range of motion, then you're not really getting much of an exercise out of it, are you? So you got to give this thing, some rest. Now, ballistic isometric, where do you think this is going to go? So this is something where you're probably going to want to take a minute between sets on a ballistic isometric. If you're being honest with yourself, you're going to need a minute to actually recuperate and be able to generate that kind of force against an immovable object. And that can be pretty stressful for our bodies, and neurologically too. So yeah, this is how you can get a nosebleed from straining. So yeah, so you got to do everything right. Now Targeting, again, I've already discussed that. We're talking about points throughout the range of motion. And say, for instance, doing a bicep curl. Throughout this range of motion, I can't just conduct a yielding isometric or a ballistic isometric or whatever and expect that training this one area is actually going to help my entire range of motion. It's not. I will still struggle here. I will still struggle around here. I will still struggle around here. But here, I'll be fine. It'll be like relief. So, if you're going to be conducting isometrics, you need to target the specific areas that you're straining. And that's really the technique behind it. That's part of the technique behind it, is where you use it, and then, you know, using it properly. And that's really part of the technique too, is, you know, getting the angles right on your isometric exercise and stuff like that. So that's really on you to be very, very thorough and have a lot of attention to detail when you're conducting these things. And then also timing is everything. So actually have a timer that's set for the rest times and the time under tension, and be very strict about it. If you're able to conduct a yielding isometric for more than 45 seconds and you're actually wanting growth, because you're going to be doing this every day, then get a bigger weight. Get some more resistance, whatever the case may be. All right? So, for instance, already talked about this right here, targeting. Yes, this would be beneficial, but not at this angle right here. This angle. This angle is beneficial because this is mimicking the certain area where you're actually going to have tension in an area that you're going to actually use. See, this is where we get functional with our isometrics. If you're going to prepare for holding a rifle, don't just be doing this. No one holds a rifle like this unless you're shooting like one-handed from the hip and you're not aiming. Reproduce presenting that rifle and holding it. Get two weights that are 2 times the weight of your actual rifle. That's how you grow. For like a yielding isometric, that's how you grow. So anyways, those are just a few examples of how I train. And also you've seen where I pancake the weight and stuff like that. Or even one of these little leg things for squashing a pistol in your grip and conditioning your pecs to actually hold it. It may not be all that much weight on this thing, but yeah, I'm still within the 30 to 45 second range. So anyways, I hope this video was helpful and somewhat interesting. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and you guys have a good one.